Welcome to our last video in our exploration of lifespan psychology. And in this video, you're going to be learning about the social relationships that we have across the lifetime. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on our early childhood relationships and experiences and how they affect our later development. So we're going to be looking at attachment, we'll look at temperament. We're also going to be looking at a theory of personality that's called the psychosocial theory of personality that was developed by Erikson. And we're also going to be taking a look at parenting styles and their effects on our development and who we become and how we see ourselves. So before we get started, I want to tell you just a little story. So once upon a time, there were three mice. The first mouse lived in a house that contained, along with furniture and other household goods and possessions, a lever and a hole in the wall from which food was delivered. And each time that the mouse pressed the lever, he would receive a tasty morsel of his favorite food. The mouse understood that when he was hungry, all he had to do was press the lever and food would arrive via the hole. The mouse took great comfort in the predictability of his access to food and only pressed the lever when he was hungry. The second mouse lived in a similar house, also containing a lever and a hole in the wall from which food was delivered. Unfortunately, though, the lever in his house was faulty, and it delivered food on an inconsistent basis when he pressed it, so that he might only receive food via that hole on the first, fifth, seventh, or even the 11th time he pressed the lever. This mouse learned that he could not always rely on the lever, and that he had to press the lever many times, and even when he was not actually hungry. So he did this in order to ensure that he'd have food. Even after his lever was fixed, he found it difficult to stop pressing it frequently, and he displayed a habit of storing up food. The third mouse also lived in a similar house, and this house contained a lever and a hole in the wall from which food was to be delivered. But the lever in his house did not work at all. And so he soon learned that he could not rely on the lever, and he'd have to develop other ways of gaining access to food. And this belief persisted even when he moved to a new home with a fully functioning lever. So I begin by sharing this story with you to help you to start thinking about the role of responsiveness in affecting our development. And so while no particular person or animal was responding to these rats, it was their expectation of whether they would be able to get food or not get food. That would, of course, then affect their behavior. So think about young babies or children and how important parental responsiveness is. And when children experience consistency and responsiveness, their outcomes are going to be very different from that of kids who experience inconsistent responsiveness or neglect. The degree to which a child experiences responsiveness and consistency contributes to something that we're going to be looking at now called attachment. In other words, it contributes to this lasting emotional connection or bond that we have with this other significant caregiver or person in our lives. And typically, the person we develop an attachment to when we're infants is the person who has the primary responsibility for caring for us. So it may be a parent, it may be a grandparent, it may be that an infant could also develop an attached relationship with someone who spends a lot of time with them who isn't connected with them at home, and that could be a teacher or someone who's a caregiver at school. So it used to be thought that attachment was formed based upon a parent or a caregiver's provision of food, and that if a caregiver provided food and whatever nourishment that the child needed, that would be enough. But we know that that's not enough. We know that children need much more than that. So in order to understand attachment, researchers had to come up with some interesting and very insightful ways of studying this very important concept. And that's what we're going to be looking at now. We're going to be taking a look at the different approaches to studying attachment and some very important classic studies on attachment and what the research has to say about the importance of forming this intense emotional connection with another person when we are very young. We're going to be looking now at attachment in childhood. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at how attachment in childhood can affect our later relationships. So let's get started in looking at attachment when we're young children.
So what do you think? How do you think parent and infant attachment bonds form? How do you think neglect could affect these bonds? And what do you think accounts for children's attachment differences? So the most influential studies that were conducted to answer these questions that you've read about in your book were conducted by Harry Harlow, by John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth. If you find these concepts related to attachment interesting, I would, like I've mentioned in the past, I would encourage you to look at, look into finding some of these researchers' original writings. I think you'll find them very interesting and insightful. And I think it will help you to better understand attachment, especially if, and this would be especially of interest to you if you are if you're a nursing major, if you're an education major, psychology major, a parent, or just interested in human behavior in general.
The first researcher to examine attachment was Harry Harlow. And Harlow placed young monkeys in cages that contained two artificial surrogate mothers. So these were not real mothers, these were artificial mothers. And one of these mothers was a simple wire contraption, and then the other was a wire contraption that was covered in cloth, just like you see here. Both of these surrogate mothers were equipped with a feeding tube so that Harlow and his fellow researchers had the option to allow that surrogate mother to deliver or to not deliver milk. And Harlow found that these young monkeys spent a lot of time with the cloth mother as opposed to the wire surrogate. So they were spending a lot more time with that monkey that was, or the artificial monkey, the artificial mother that was providing warmth and comfort. And this was true even when infants were fed by the wire mother rather than the cloth one. So these infant monkeys seem to be very drawn to spending time with that cloth surrogate mother. And so this suggested that the strong emotional bond that infants form with their primary caregivers is rooted in something more than whether that caregiver provides food. Now, Harlow's research is now regarded as one of the first experimental demonstrations of the importance of what's called contact comfort in the establishment of infant caregiver bonds. I'd encourage you to be sure to read the chapter and the section of the chapter on attachment so that you're aware of how this study was conducted and what Harlow found.
I think it's important to note that we'll be looking at here in a moment is that attachment is important not only during childhood, but it stays with us. There's a lot of research that suggests that our attachment style that we've had with our parents can affect later relationships that we have. So that if we feel like our caregivers were responsive and consistent and helped to take care of our needs, then that's going to promote a sense of security. And then we then engage in relationships or feel similarly in relationships with other significant people as we did when we were very small. But if you have a parent who is inconsistent or neglectful, then this can lead to insecure attachment. And then this carries on often for that individual and can affect relationships where they might feel like it's hard to get close or that they feel anxious because they're worried that that person's going to leave them and they need consistent reminders that everything's okay. So we talked about Harlow and what attachment is. Let's talk about John Bowlby. And so John Bowlby defined attachment as an affectional bond or tie that an infant forms with the mother. Now, you might wonder, which attachment definition do I need? It's not really a specific definition that you need. You just need to be able to think about what attachment is and be able to articulate it. Of course, the tests in this class are multiple choice, but I think the way I would think about it is, it's the relationship. It's an intense relationship. It's reciprocal, and it forms with a caregiver. Bowlby focused on the mother, but we know that we can develop attachment relationships with other people who are important caregivers. So Bowlby said that the bond must be made with the primary caregiver in order to have normal social and emotional development. And he saw attachment as an all or nothing process. And he suggested that there was something called a secure base, and that the parental presence really is what is providing this, and it gives the child a sense of safety as they explore their surroundings. So remember what I mentioned a moment ago about how important attachment is in promoting cognitive development. If you don't feel secure, you're not going to be as likely to explore. And so when you feel secure, you have that secure base, and you're going to feel like you can explore your environment. And exploration in childhood is important in cognitive development. So what are the requirements then for healthy attachment? The caregiver needs to be responsive to the child's physical needs, their social needs, and their emotional needs. You will hear people say things like, if for those of you who already are parents, you may have heard these statements, or maybe you, when you become a parent, you may hear people say these things. They might say things like, don't pick up that baby, you're going to spoil them. I want to point out very clearly that you cannot spoil a baby. You cannot provide a baby with too much comfort and love. When a baby is crying and wants to be held, it is important that you are consistent and responsive. It's also important that that you are, recognizing and able to recognize the needs of the child so that you can recognize their emotional expressions and adapt accordingly. Now, for new parents, this can be a learning process, but you pretty quickly figure out what different facial expressions mean and even what different cries mean. And so this is that intense reciprocal relationship that I'm talking about that develops. So the caregiver and child need to engage in mutually enjoyable reactions. These are those reciprocal parts of the relationship. And then we have Mary Ainsworth, and what she did is she studied attachment by creating what she called the strange situation test. And so she wanted to know, do children differ in the way that they bond? And if they do, why? And so she looked to answer this question through a procedure that was known as the strange situation. So in this situation, what she would do is she would have a mother who was the caregiver and an infant who are placed in a room together. And keep in mind, this is an experimental situation. You can't replicate this at home, and you should not draw broad conclusions based upon how your child responds when you pick them up from school, okay? Because this is an experimentally contrived situation. So the stranger enters the room, and then the mother leaves. So mother and infant are placed in the room with toys, then a stranger enters the room, and the mom leaves. After a few minutes, the mom returns to the room and comforts the child. The question is, how is the child going to respond? And so what she found was that children were responding differently, and she was able to really notice that there were 3 different styles of attachment, 3 different major categories of responses that those children had. And then a 4th was later identified. And you can note from your textbook, she had found secure attachment, resistant, avoidant, and then, like I mentioned, the 4th that was later identified was disorganized. So what's a secure attachment looking like? What are the characteristics? And so with a secure attachment, the child is using the parent as a secure base from which to explore. Remember how important I said this is for cognitive development, but it's also perhaps even more important because when we think about child development, emotional health and well-being is so important. And so the child needs to know that their mother is going to return, that they're consistent and they're responsive. So when you have that secure attachment, what happens is, again, this is that really serving as a foundation for healthy emotional development. So here, the child was distressed when the mother left, but then happy to see the mother when the mother returned. And this was common when caregivers are sensitive and responsive to the child's needs. Then we have avoidant. And so avoidant was where she found that the child was unresponsive to the parent. They don't use the parent as a secure base, and they didn't care if the parent left. Here, the child was slow to show positive reaction when the mother returned, and this was found to be common when caregivers are insensitive and inattentive to needs. I think about this as being related to someone who perhaps a parent or whoever the caregiver is has an undiagnosed and untreated mental health condition, perhaps a serious one like major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Now, once treated, I wouldn't say that. But if the parent is not treated and has symptoms of those significant disorders, then it would be harder for them to be responsive and be as sensitive to their child. Or someone who has an addiction, who's in the midst of the addiction, not someone who's overcome addiction, but someone who's using substances. It's going to be much more difficult for them to be sensitive and attentive to the child's needs. And then we have resistant, and this is where the child shows clingy behavior and then rejects the mother's attempts to interact with them. So here, in this instance, what she found was that the child did not explore the toys, became extremely disturbed and angry when the mother left, and these kids were difficult to comfort when the mother returned. This was common when the caregiver was inconsistent with the level of response. And then we have disorganized, and this is where the child is showing odd behavior around the caregiver. Maybe they behave oddly when the mother left, tried to run away when the mother returned, and this is common when a child has been abused.
As you've learned about attachment and the importance of attachment in early childhood, I'd ask you to think about how attachment relationships when we're young children can affect us as we move into adulthood. How do they affect, for example, romantic relationships or the development of friendships? So researchers suggest that as we grow and develop, that we gradually transfer these attachment relationships and dynamics from parents to peers as we develop. So even though young children tend to use their parents as their primary attachment figure, as they reach adolescence and then young adulthood, they begin to rely more upon close friends and romantic partners for their basic attachment-related functions. So even though a young child may turn to their mother for comfort, support, and guidance when they're distressed, when they're scared or sick, young adults may be more likely to turn to their romantic partners for these purposes when they have similar situations. So there was a very interesting research study that was done a couple of decades ago. And what these researchers found was that they were able to identify attachment styles that people had in adulthood. And so in their research, they found that about 47% of the people that they were doing research on could be classified as having a secure attachment style. And then 18% tended to be dismissing, and 14% tended to be preoccupied, and 21% were fearful. So dismissing, those people were not very comfortable with being connected. They tended to push away other people from that potential connected relationship. And this was more likely to happen among men than it was among women. In terms of being preoccupied would be a more anxious attachment style. And this would be where you're needing reassurance. You need to know regularly that that person cares about you, that they're there for you. And it turned out that more women than men tended to have this preoccupied style of attachment. So research has consistently shown that people who are relatively secure as children, that they tend to be much more likely to have higher functioning relationships as they go into adulthood than those who have had insecure attachments. And they're also more likely to find their relationships as being satisfying and lasting longer and being less characterized by conflict. So having supportive and responsive experiences with caregivers early in our lives, it's assumed that this sets the stage for positive social development. But that doesn't mean that attachment patterns are set in stone. So you may have had a very secure attachment relationship with a significant caregiver when you were a child. That doesn't mean that you are going to have very secure attachment relationships as you move into adulthood. And the opposite is also true. Having insecure attachments when you're a child does not mean absolutely that you're going to have insecure attachment relationships as you go into adulthood. But what we can say is that you're much more likely to have healthy, satisfying relationships as you move into adulthood if you have that secure attachment with a parent or caregiver early on. And that person does not have to be a parent. It's anyone who could be significant in your life who you feel is responsive and consistent. And I want to point out too that if a person has insecure attachment when they're a young child, that there are many different corrective experiences that that person can have to help them overcome those feelings of insecurity. This could include having relationships with siblings, other family members, teachers, or close friends. So when we think about security in adulthood, we really could think of it as a culmination of a person's attachment history rather than a reflection solely of their early experiences. Those early experiences play an important role, but so too do later potential corrective actions or later negative experiences. So overall, what we could say is that early experiences provide a foundation for our later experiences.
The development of a healthy self-concept can depend on parenting styles. And one particular researcher, Diana Baumrein, she identified 3 different parenting styles, and these are authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive. And then we see an additional style that's called the uninvolved style. So let's take a look at first the authoritative style. So the authoritative style, or the authoritative parent, sets reasonable limits for their children, but they're not overly controlling. So the parent here is the authority figure. They're firm, but they're understanding. They're willing to give advice, but they also want to listen to children's concerns. So in this type of parenting style, parents will explain the reasons for their decisions rather than just laying down the law. And the research suggests that in the United States, authoritative parenting is the most successful parenting style. And that children who have authoritative parents, they tend to achieve the most positive outcomes in childhood and adolescence. They tend to have high self-esteem, they tend to be self-reliant, competent, and popular with their peers. And so this flexible, but you can see here firm child rearing approach encourages children to be independent and assertive, but also respectful to the needs of others. Let's take a look at the authoritarian style. So authoritarian parents, they are rigid and overly controlling, and they expect and they demand unquestioned obedience from their children. So if children were to ask why they're being told to do something, the answer is likely to be, because I say so. And authoritarian parents tend to be unresponsive to their child's needs, and they're more likely to rely on harsh forms of discipline, and while allowing their children to have very little control over their own lives. Children who grow up with authoritarian parents, they're more likely to be inhibited, moody, withdrawn, fearful, and distrustful of others. And they're also at, interestingly, a higher risk for some additional negative outcomes. Like even one research study suggests that they're at an increased risk of becoming overweight. And that may not be that it's directly leading to increased consumption of food. There may just be some other factors that are leading to that. And so there's some correlational indicators here. And children who have authoritarian parents, they typically perform more poorly in school. They're more dependent, and they're more likely to lack initiative and lack self-confidence, more likely to feel conflicted and to be unfriendly towards their peers. So I think this is interesting because what you'll find often is that a parent who is authoritarian may really think that that approach to parenting is the best approach, and they have the child's best interest at heart, but they don't perhaps realize that there are these very plausible negative outcomes. Now keep in mind there are always going to be there are going to be exceptions to these generalizations that we're talking about here. And there are other factors that contribute to these outcomes. But parenting styles are very important in affecting child development. Let's take a look at permissive. Permissive parents, they tend to have an anything goes attitude towards their children, and they may respond affectionately, but they're really lax in setting limits and imposing discipline. And children who have permissive parents, they tend to be impulsive and lack self-control themselves. And So children who grow up in this parenting style, they are, because they lack the experience of really conforming to other people's demands, they may not develop very effective interpersonal skills. Another parenting style is the uninvolved parenting approach, and these parents tend to be indifferent, they're uninvolved, they may be neglectful. This is where we see children who perhaps who have parents who have a serious mental illness or drug addiction. So these are the major parenting styles. The most ideal is an authoritative parenting style. That's ideal here in the United States. The authoritarian style actually may be ideal in some cultures. Like I've read recently that in some Asian cultures, this may be more ideal, but certainly permissive and uninvolved is not ideal. And here in the West, and I would probably suggest that in most of Europe, you'd find that the authoritative style is going to be the most ideal with the most positive outcomes. It's important to note that parenting style can depend on the temperament of a child. And if you were to ask parents who have 2 or more children, you might hear them say, they're just different. I don't know why they're different, but they just are. Now we know that personality obviously can play a very important role in these differences, but there are these innate traits that play an important role in differences that we see among children. And these innate traits that affect how one thinks, behaves, and reacts to the environment is known as temperament. So a temperament is a characteristic style of behavior, or it's a disposition. And one child might display a very cheerful, easygoing temperament when they're approaching new situations, and another may be more fearful, or they may be more apprehensive. So there are some major styles of temperament or types of temperament. So let's take a look at each of these. So we have easy children, or an easy temperament, and these children are playful, they respond positively to new stimuli, they adapt easily to changes, they tend to be happy and have an engaging mood. They, when they come home from the hospital, they develop regular sleeping and feeding schedules. I would encourage, if you're able to talk to your parent or whoever your primary caregiver was when you were a baby, if you are able to talk with them about this, I would encourage you to ask them, what kind of parenting, what kind of child were you? Were you an easy child? Or were you more difficult, which we're going to be looking at here in a moment? Or were you what we might call slow to warm up? So in one study that was done back in the 90s, they found that around 40% of children had this easy style of temperament. And so this type of temperament is more likely then to elicit warm and responsive parenting. So the way the child naturally behaves is going to affect then the way that the parent responds. Then we have another type of temperament, which is called the difficult temperament. And children who have this type of temperament tend to react negatively to new situations. They tend to be more irritable, and they have difficulty establishing regular sleeping and feeding schedules. And in the same study I just mentioned that was done in the 90s in New York, they found that about 10% of children fell into this group. And then we have what's called slow to warm up. And children who are slow to warm up, they have lower activity levels. They tend to avoid new stimuli. They require more time to adjust to new situations than most children. They might react to unfamiliar situations by being withdrawn, by being mildly distressed. And in the same study, about 15% of children were in this group. So, remember, easy temperament is likely to elicit warm and responsive parenting. Whereas parents who have children that are more difficult, this may cause parents to withdraw and even feel irritated as they're trying to meet the needs of the child, and it seems like it's just really challenging to meet them. So this can then affect the parent-child relationship. It really requires a lot more, it requires a lot of patience and intentional parenting when children are more difficult. And I want to point out that the difficult temperament is it can be explained by many different factors, but one thing that can very significantly contribute to this is the sensitivity of the child to new stimuli, to new things in their environment. So when children who are difficult are, new people come in the house, or there's a lot of noise, they're going to be more likely to get upset. So it would be important for parents to be aware of this so that then they can adjust that in their house, so that they, as the child grows, they can warn the child and say, hey, so-and-so is coming over, or they can make sure that there's not a lot of noise in the house, especially when the child's tired or when the child's hungry. That's when they're going to be even more sensitive to those things that are going on. And that can help to negate some of the responses from the child that may be more stressful to both the child and to the parent.
Erikson is a very well-known psychodynamic theorist, and he emphasized the importance of social relationships in development. In Erikson's view, psychosocial development progresses through a series of stages that begin in early childhood and then they continue through adulthood. He believed that our personalities are shaped by how we deal with a series of what he called psychosocial crises or challenges during these stages. We're going to be exploring each of these stages. The first psychosocial challenge that infants face is the development of what's called trust versus mistrust. And so the child needs to develop a sense of trust of its social environment. And when you think about the things that parents can do to promote trust, probably a significant thing that comes to you would be positive parent-child relationships, where parents treat the infant warmly and are responsive to its needs. And so when they do this, a sense of trust and warmth towards others begins to develop. But if parents are seldom there when the infant needs them, or if they're detached, or maybe they respond coldly, the infant develops a basic mistrust of others. And for that infant, the world can seem threatening. Erikson believed that the central psychosocial challenge that is faced during the second and third years of life, the second stage that is here on the screen, that this concerns what he called autonomy. And so here the child's becoming mobile, and they're getting into, as you probably have noticed with children who are this age, they get into lots of things. And parents can warmly encourage their child towards greater independence and nurture in this newly developed sense of autonomy. But if they demand too much too soon, or they make lots of demands that the child can't meet, such as in the area of toilet training, for example, the child might have feelings of self-doubt or shame, and that could later affect development and then continue into adulthood. The third stage is what is known as initiative versus guilt. And this stage corresponds to the preschool years of 3 to 6. Now, of course, 3 and 4 and perhaps 5 would be officially preschool. And then we have kindergarten following after. And for some kids, they're starting first grade around this time. And so this is the period we're talking about. And at this time, children are really learning about what their bodies and their minds are capable of and what they can do socially. And children who succeed in these efforts of, in doing these things like playing with friends and climbing on, on play sets and in anything that they're enjoying, when they succeed in these efforts and they're praised for their accomplishments, they come to develop a sense of initiative and competence. But children who may struggle to accomplish these tasks, and they may develop feelings of guilt and powerlessness. And so you can imagine then how important it is for parents to create opportunities to be successful, for educators to create opportunities. And also for not only for there to be the just general creation of opportunities, but for parents and educators to be present and supportive and to scaffold that learning. So when we think of a scaffolding, I think of someone who's building a house, and the scaffolding is used to elevate the people who are perhaps laying the brick on the house. So it's providing them with support. And that's what we want to do with children, is we want to provide them with that support so that eventually we can release that support and they can be successful on their own. And then this is very helpful in promoting a sense of initiative and competence. The fourth stage is what's called industry versus inferiority. And at this stage, the child is approximately 6 to 11, 7 to 11, and the child faces the central challenge of developing what's called industriousness and self-confidence. And children believe that, if children believe that they perform competently in the classroom and when they're with their friends, they will likely become industrious. And so then they're more likely to take an active role in school and extracurricular activities. But if they are not successful and failure outweighs successes, then they may develop feelings of inadequacy and inferiority, and the child may become withdrawn and unmotivated. So here again, just like the last stage, we can think about how important it is for children to be given opportunities to be successful, for parents and educators to scaffold that learning. And that learning is not only taking place academically, but the learning in sports or learning socially, so that the child can be successful. This is very important when it comes to developing self-confidence. It's also important that children are given opportunities in different domains to be successful. So that if they're not doing so well in one area, then they have another area that they can be successful in, so that they can develop that sense of self-confidence. The fifth stage that Erikson said that each of us go through is what's called identity versus confusion. And this is from approximately 12 to 18 years of age. So during adolescence, there are questions that individuals grapple with, like, who am I and what am I good at? Where am I headed? What's important to me? What do I value? Also, there's the development of an ethnic identity, of a connectedness with one's ethnic and cultural heritage. And this is an important part of the process of identity formation during adolescence, especially for adolescents of color and adolescents who are whose parents may have recently immigrated to the United States or grandparents have. So this is a very important time of development where we are exploring who we are. And so what we want to see develop is an ego identity. This is an attainment of a real firm sense of self, who we are, where we're headed, what we believe in. And Erikson believed that people who achieve this ego identity, they clearly understand their needs, their values, and their goals. And so some of you may have heard the phrase identity crisis, and this has been used to describe a stressful period of self-examination that adolescents go through. But some people say that maybe we should think of it more as exploration instead of crisis, so that we're not implying that just examining different possibilities is fraught with anguish and with struggle. So and that's something for you to think about. You may feel like crisis is more appropriate, but some researchers suggest that exploration might be more appropriate. So adolescents who successfully get through this stage, they emerge as their own people who've achieved that ego identity, and they continue to, and then I want to point out to you though that throughout life they continue to develop their identity. So it's not as though you are exactly who you are when you're adolescents and that's it. But it is important in helping us in the next stage, which we'll be looking at here in just a moment. And having formed a sense of identity is important for later feelings of well-being. And but at the same rate, I want to point out though that, as many of you know, your political views, perhaps your moral views and religious beliefs do change over time. When adolescents don't grapple with this identity crisis, they may still develop an ego identity, but they've done so by modeling themselves after others. So instead of actively exploring, they have committed to someone else's beliefs and values without thinking about them. And it's fine to be like someone else, like your parents or your friends, if you have actively explored on your own, according to Erikson. And so if we don't actively explore who we are and have this what Erikson called an identity crisis, you may fail to really develop a clear sense of yourself, and you stay in a state of what he called role diffusion, where you're sort of in a drifting state where you lack a clear set of values and direction. And then if this happens, you may be very vulnerable to negative peer influences. And so I want to move on to the next stage, which is intimacy versus isolation. So the next stage, according to Erikson, is intimacy versus isolation. This is the key crisis of young adulthood. And the key crisis involves forming intimate relationships that instead of being lonely and isolated from others. And Erikson suggested, and you could imagine why, that young adults who have developed a strong sense of ego identity and actively explored who they are and committed, in other words, that they may be more prepared in early adulthood to form intimate relationships. Think about this. If you know who you are and what you believe in, then you're more likely to identify someone you'd like to have a committed relationship with, or a friend that you'd like to have a really good friendship with, or if you know who you are, then you're more likely to not only identify someone, you're also likely to stay committed to that person, because you're not going to be changing based upon what is, the whims of others. So individuals who have failed to achieve ego identity or commitment, may lack a personal stability to form lasting, secure relationships. The seventh stage of development, according to Erikson, is generativity versus stagnation. And this is faced during midlife. And by generativity, he meant efforts that are directed to shaping a new generation or generations to come. And shaping can come from raising your own children, or helping to make the world a better place for other children or for future generations. And you can think about the multitude of ways that you can do this, whether it be through volunteering, maybe where you work, you're doing something very positive for your community. It may involve being a mentor in your workplace. It might involve being an important person in your niece or your nephew's life. And so Erikson believes that a failure to achieve generativity can lead to stagnation. And this is a self-absorption where people indulge themselves like as though they are their only child. And so this is a very important task in midlife. So we're now at the last stage, ego integrity versus despair. And this is the stage of late adulthood. And Erikson believed that the basic psychological challenge of later adulthood is a struggle to have a sense of meaning and a sense of satisfaction in life, rather than having a sense of despair and bitterness. People who achieve a state of integrity, they're able to come to terms with their lives. They're able to accept that there were good things and not so good things about their lives, that they can really think about the totality of their life experiences. And I think it's important to note here that while as we look at ego integrity versus despair, you might think, wow, there's a lot for one to have gotten through positively to have a sense of integrity. Well, what's great about this theory is that you don't have to have gotten through each of these stages successfully during that given time period. You can always grow and develop and overcome any of the problems that you had during any of these stages. So for example, during stage 6, perhaps someone does not experience intimacy. Well, they could later on experience that, which could then positively affect them as they progress into the next stage. In this stage of the first stage, trust versus mistrust, perhaps they were in a home where someone was not consistent in meeting their needs and wasn't there for them. But then later, they can have a close relationship with someone who does. That person could be a family member, a really good friend, or a boyfriend, girlfriend, or anyone, or husband, wife, anyone who they're able to develop that sense of trust with. I also want to point out that you may successfully get through one of these stages, but that doesn't mean that you can't have any problems later on that are related to that. So your parents may have done a great job in helping you to develop a sense of trust, but then later on, you may develop a sense of mistrust in others because of perhaps being in a relationship with someone who betrayed you. So, I think overall we need to take away from this that personality is continuously developing and changing. And we need to also take away from this that there are multiple opportunities for us to grow and to positively develop into the people that we can ultimately become, so we have a sense of integrity at the end of our lives. So what have you learned about our psychosocial development and about attachment? Well, you learned about attachment and that it's an emotional bond between two people. And that it's very important that early on, when we're young, when we're infants and toddlers, that we experience this secure and consistent responsiveness from our parents or whoever that caregiver is. However, we do know that there can be many corrective actions and there can be people in our lives who can help us to overcome any feelings of insecurity that we may have had in that attachment relationship. Those can include people like siblings, other family members. It can also include teachers. So there are many opportunities for us to overcome this insecure attachment. Also, when we think about our early development, it is so important because it is a very sensitive time. It's a time during which we are sensitive to those experiences. And we're sensitive because our brain is developing and our outlook on relationships is forming, not just cognitively, but even neurobiologically. You also learned about Bowlby and attachment, and you'll remember that he defined attachment as the affectional bond or tie that an infant forms with its significant caregiver. And that in order for us to have healthy social development, it's optimal for us to have this connection with that significant caregiver in our lives. You also learned about Mary Ainsworth and the strange situation, how she studied attachment. And then you also learned about infant attachment. You learned about contact comfort as you learned about Harry Harlow's study on attachment and how monkeys were more likely to connect with and cling to that warm mother. The one who was not real, was a surrogate mother, but was covered in cloth and provided those feelings of warmth and comfort. You also learned about secure versus insecure attachment styles and that great importance of caregiver responsiveness. You also learned about some of the effects of our early attachment experiences on later relationships and whether we may feel insecure about those relationships, whether we feel like we can depend on that person to be consistent, or are we going to feel uncomfortable with connection because we didn't have that connection with another person when we were infants? And again, there are many different corrective actions that can help us to overcome those experiences, but we are at an increased risk without those corrective actions of having some struggles that those who've experienced secure attachment would not be as likely to have. You also learned about parenting styles and that the most ideal parenting style is authoritative parenting. And this is a parenting style that is very democratic. It's one in which the parent sets guidelines and has expectations, but is still very warm and takes into consideration the child's point of view and perspective. And you also learned about Erikson's psychosocial theory of personality development. As you reflect on each of these and what you've learned, I'd encourage you to think about your own experiences. I'd encourage you to think about the experiences of others that you know. Remember that our early experiences do not set the destiny or fate for the rest of our lives. But if we do have early experiences where we may have had some insecure attachment, then it is going to be helpful and important for us to seek out opportunities to heal from that. And that can be through siblings, other family members, it can be through teachers, and it can also be, of course, through seeking the help of a professional counselor or psychologist. If you have any questions as you reflect on what you've learned about any of the concepts in our chapter on lifespan psychology, I encourage you to please reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing each of you online.